Okay, sorry, I just ran across my house to get a cup so I could pour my soda in it, which I'm going to do right now. So, reading the rest of chapter 13, which I think is like 268 to 270 something. But I'm going to skip the varying viewpoints at the end because I have to leave in like 20 minutes. And also I'm going to read, so what's this heading called? The Lone Star Rebellion. I'm going to sorry, I just ran. I'm going to read the Lone Star Rebellion, and then I'm going to skip a page ahead and read Makers of America, and then I'm going to go back and read the Log Cabins and Hard Cider of 1840. Okay, soda has been poured. Okay. So, let me just get the carbon. Come on, what? That's good. Okay. The Lone Star Rebellion. Early in 1836, the Texans declared their independence, unfurled their Lone Star flag, and named Sam Houston commander-in-chief. Santa Anna, at the head of about 6,000 men, swept ferociously into Texas. Dropping a band of nearly 200 pugnacious Texans at the Alamo and San Antonio, he wiped them out to a man after a 13-day siege. The Texans' commander, Colonel W.B. Travis, had declared, "I shall never surrender nor retreat, victory or death." A short time later, a band of about 400 surrounded and defeated American volunteers, having thrown down their arms at Goliad, were butchered as pirates. All these operations further delayed the Mexican advance and galvanized American opposition. Slain heroes like Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, well known in life, became legendary in death. Texan war cries, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, and death to Santa Anna," swept up into the United States. Scores of vengeful Americans seized their rifles and rushed to the aid of relatives, friends, and compatriots. General Sam Houston's small army retreated to the east, luring Santa Anna to San Jacinto, near the site of the city that now bears Houston's name. The Mexicans numbered about 1,300 men, and the Texans about 900. Suddenly, on April 21st, 1836, Houston turned. Taking full advantage of the Mexican siesta, the Texans wiped out the pursuing force and captured Santa Anna, who was found cowering in the tall grass near the battlefield. Confronted with thirsty Bowie knives, the quaking dictator was speedily induced to sign the true treaties. By their terms, he agreed to withdraw Mexican troops and to recognize the Rio Grande as the extreme southwestern boundary of Texas. When released, he repudiated the agreement as illegal because it had been extorted under duress. These events put the U.S. government in a sticky situation. The Texans, though courageous, could hardly have won their independence without the help in men and supplies from their American cousins. The Washington government, as the Mexicans bitterly complained, had a solemn obligation under the international law to enforce its leaky neutrality statutes. But American public opinion, overwhelmingly favorable to the Texans, openly nullified the existing legislation. The federal authorities were powerless to act, and on the day before he left office in 1837, President Jackson even extended the right hand of recognition to the Lone Star Republic, led by his old comrade in arms against the Indians, Sam Houston. Many Texans wanted not just recognition of their independence, but outright union with the United States. What nation in its right mind, they reasoned, would refuse so lavish a dowry? The radiant Texas bride, officially petitioning for annexation in 1837, presented herself for marriage. But the expectant groom, Uncle Sam, was jerked back by the black hand of the slavery issue. Anti-slavery crusaders in the North were opposing annexation with increasing vehemence. They contended that the whole scheme was merely a conspiracy cooked up by the Southern slavocracy to bring new slave pens into the Union. At first glance, a slavery plot charge seemed plausible. Most of the early settlers in Texas, as well as American volunteers during the Revolution, had come from the states of the South and Southwest, but scholars have concluded that no pro-slavery plot existed. Most of the immigrants came from the South and Southwest simply because these states were closer. The explanation was proximity rather than conspiracy. Yet the fact remained that many Texans were slaveholders, and admitting Texas to the Union inescapably meant enlarging American slavery. Okay. Makers of America. Mexican or Texican? Mexican or Texican? Ooh. Moses Austin, born a Connecticut Yankee in 1761, was determined to be Spanish, if that's what it took to acquire cheap land and freedom from pesky laws. In 1798, he tramped into untracked Missouri, still part of the Spanish Louisiana, and pledged his allegiance to the King of Spain. He was not pleased when the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 restored him to American citizenship. In 1820, with his old Spanish passport in his saddlebag, he rode into Spanish Texas and asked for permission to establish a colony of 300 families. Sorry. Austin's request posed a dilemma for the Texas governor. The Spanish authorities had repeatedly stamped out the bands of American horse thieves and squatters who periodically splashed across the Red and Sabine rivers from the United States into Spanish territory. Yet the Spanish had lured only some 3,000 of their own settlers into Texas during their 3 centuries of rule. If the land were ever to be wrested from the Indians and civilized, maybe Austin's plan could do it. Hoping that this band of the right sort of Americans might prevent the further encroachment of buck-skinned border ruffians, the governor reluctantly agreed to Austin's proposal. Upon Moses Austin's death in 1821, the task of realizing his dream fell to his 27-year-old son, Stephen. "I bid an everlasting farewell to my native country," Stephen Austin said, and he crossed into Texas on July 15, 1821, determined to fulfill rigidly all the duties and obligations of a Mexican citizen. Mexico declared its independence from Spain in early 1821 and finalized its agreement with Austin in 1823. Soon he learned fluent Spanish and was signing his name as Don Esteban F. Austin in his new colony between the Brazos and Colorado rivers. He allowed no drunkard, no gambler, no profane swearer, no idler, and sternly enforced these rules. Not only did he banish several families as undesirables, but he ordered the public flogging of unwanted interlopers. Austin fell just 3 families short of recruiting the 300 households that his father had contracted to bring to Texas. The original settlers were still dubbed the Old 300, and the Texas equivalent of New England's Mayflower Pilgrims were the first families of Virginia. Mostly Scotch-Irish Southerners from the trans-Appalachian frontier, the Old 300 were cultured folk by the frontier standards, but all 4 of them were literate, not illiterate. Other settlers followed from Europe as well as America. Within 10 years, the Anglos, many of them French and German, outnumbered the Mexican residents, or Tejanos, 10-1, and soon evolved a distinctive Texican culture. The wide-ranging horse patrols organized to attack Indian camps because the Texas Rangers, Samuel Maverick, whose unbranded calves roamed the limitless prairies, left his surname as a label for rebellious loners who refused to run with the herd, and Jared Gross, an Alabama planter, whose caravan of 50 covered wagons and 100 slaves arrived in 1822, etched the original image of the larger-than-life big-time Texas operator. The original Anglo-Texans brought with them the old Scots-Irish frontiersmen hostility to authority. They ignored Mexican laws and officials, including restrictions against owning or importing slaves. When the Mexican government tried to impose its will on the Anglo-Texans in 1830, they took up their guns. Like the American revolutionaries of the 1770s, who at first demanded only the rights of Englishmen, the Texans began asking simply for Mexican recognition of their rights, as guaranteed by the Mexican Constitution of 1824. But bloodshed at the Alamo in 1836, like that at Lexington and Concord in 1775, transformed protest into rebellion. Texas lay, and still lies, along the frontier where Hispanic and Anglo-American cultures met, mingled, and clashed. In part, the Texas Revolution was a contest between those 2 cultures, but it was also a contest about philosophies of government, pitting liberal frontier ideals of freedom against the conservative concept of centralized control. Stephen Austin sincerely tried to Mexicanize himself and his followers until the Mexican government grew too arbitrary and authoritarian. And not all the Texan revolutionaries were Anglos. Many Tejanos fought for Texas independence. 7 perished defending the Alamo. Among the 59 signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence were several Hispanics, including the Tejanos Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz. Lorenzo de Zavala, an ardent Mexican liberal who had long resisted centralizing tendencies of Mexico's dominant political party, was designated vice president of the Texas Republic's interim government in 1836. Like the Austins, these Tejanos and Mexicans had sought in Texas an escape from overbearing governmental authority. Their role in the revolution underscores the fact that the uprising was a struggle between defenders of local rights and the agents of central authority as much as it was a fight between Anglo and Mexican cultures. Log cabins and hard cider of 1840. I don't know why I got a soda. I'm leaving in 10 minutes, but still tastes good. Log cabins and hard cider of 1840. Martin Van Buren was renominated by the Democrats in 1840, albeit without terrific enthusiasm. The party had no acceptable alternative to what the Whigs called Martin Van Ruin. The Whigs, hungering for the spoils of office, scented victory in the breeze. Pangs of the panic were still being felt, and voters blamed their woes on the party in power. Learning from their mistake in 1836, the Whigs united behind one candidate, Ohio's William Henry Harrison. He was not their ablest statesman, that would have been Daniel Webster or Henry Clay, but he was believed to be their ablest vote-getter. The aging hero, nearly 68 when the campaign ended, was known for his successes against Indians and the British at the battles of Tippecanoe and the Thames. Harrison's views on current issues were only vaguely known. The old Tippecanoe was nominated primarily because he was issueless and enemyless, a tested recipe for electoral success that still appeals today. John Tyler of Virginia, an afterthought, was selected as his vice presidential running mate. The Whigs, eager to avoid offense, published no official platform, hoping to sweep their hero into office with a frothy huzzah for her Harrison campaign, reminiscent of Jackson's triumph in 1828. A dull-witted Democratic editor played directly into Whig's hands. Stupidly insulting the West, he lampooned Harrison as an impoverished old farmer who should be content with a pension, a log cabin, and a barrel of hard cider, the poor Westerner's champagne. Whigs gleefully adopted honest hard cider and the sturdy log cabin as symbols of their campaign. Harrisonites portrayed their hero as the poor farmer of North Bend, who had been called from his cabin and his plow to drive corrupt Jackson's spoilsmen from the presidential palace. They denounced Van Buren as a supercilious aristocrat, simpering dandy who wore corsets and ate French food from golden plates. As a daring Whig campaign song proclaimed, "Old Tip, he wears a homespun shirt. He has no ruffled shirt, wort, wort. But Matt, he has a golden plate. He's a little squirt, wort, wort." The Whig campaign was a masterpiece of inane hoopla. Log cabins were dished up in every conceivable form. Bawling Whigs, stimulated by fortified cider, rolled huge inflated balls from village to village, state to state, balls that represented the snowballing majority for Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. In truth, Harrison was not low-born, but from one of the FFV's, First Families of Virginia. He was not poverty-stricken. He did not live in a one-room log cabin, but rather in a 16-room mansion on a 3,000-acre farm. He did not swill down gallons of hard cider. He evidently preferred whiskey, and he did not plow his fields with his own huge paws. But such details had not mattered when General Jackson rode to victory, and they did not matter now. The Democrats who hurrahed Jackson into the White House in 1828 now discovered to their chagrin that whooping it up for the backwoods Westerner was a game that two could play. Harrison won by the surprisingly close margin of 1,274,624 to 1,127,781, the popular votes, but by an overwhelming electoral margin of 234 to 60. With hardly a real issue debated, though with hard times blighting the incumbent's fortunes, Van Buren was washed out of Washington on a wave of apple juice. The hard ciderites had apparently received a mandate to tear down the White House and erect a log cabin. Although campaigners in 1840 did their best to bury substantive issues behind the ballyhoo, voters actually faced a stark choice between the two economic visions of how to cope with the nation's first major depression. Whigs sought to expand and stimulate the economy, while Democrats favored retrenchment and an end to high-flying banks and aggressive corporations. Politics for the people. The election of 1840 conclusively demonstrated two major changes in American politics since the era of good feelings. The first was the triumph of a populist democratic style. Democracy had something of a taint in the days of the lordly Federalists. Martha Washington, the First Lady, was shocked after a presidential reception to find a greasy smear on the wallpaper, left there, she was sure, by an uninvited, filthy Democrat. But by the 1840s, aristocracy was the taint, and democracy was respectable. Politicians were now forced to curry favor with the voting masses. Lucky indeed was the aspiring office-seeker who could boast of birth in a log cabin. In 1840, Daniel Webster publicly apologized for not being able to claim so humble a birthplace, though he quickly added that his brothers could. Hopelessly handicapped was the candidate who appeared to be too clean, too well-dressed, too grammatical, too high-browishly intellectual. In truth, most high political offices continued to be filled by leading citizens, but now these wealthy and prominent men had to forsake all social pretensions and cultivate to the common touch if they hoped to win elections. Snobbish bigwigs, unhappy over the change, sneered at coonskin congressmen and at the newly enfranchised bipeds of the forest. To them, the tyranny of king numbers was no less offensive than that of King George. But these critics protested in vain. The common man was at last moving to the center of the national political stage, the sturdy American who donned coarse trousers rather than buff breeches, who sported a coonskin cap rather than a silk top hat, and who wore no man's collar, often not even one of his own. Instead of the old divine right of kings, America was now bowing to the divine right of the people. The two-party system. The second dramatic change resulting from the 1840 election was the formation of a vigorous and durable two-party system. The Jeffersonians of an earlier day had been so successful in absorbing the programs of their Federalist opponents that a full-blown two-party system had never truly emerged in the subsequent era of good feelings. The idea had prevailed that parties of any sort smacked of conspiracy and faction and were injurious to the health of the body politic and a virtuous republic. By 1840, political parties had fully come of age, a lasting legacy of Andrew Jackson's and Martin Van Buren's tenaciousness. Both national parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, grew out of the rich soil of Jeffersonian republicanism, and each laid claim to different aspects of the Republican inheritance. Jacksonian Democrats glorified the liberty of the individual and were fiercely on guard against the inroads of privilege into government. Whigs trumpeted the natural harmony of society and the value of community, and were willing to use government to realize their objectives. Whigs also berated those leaders, and they considered Jackson to be one, whose appeals to self-interest fostered conflict among individuals, classes, or sections. Democrats clung to states' rights and federal restraint in social and economic affairs as their basic doctrines. Whigs tended to favor a renewed national bank, protective tariffs, internal improvements, public schools, and increasingly moral reforms such as the prohibition of liquor and eventually the abolition of slavery. The two parties were thus separated by real differences of philosophy and policy, but they also had much in common. Both were mass-based, catch-all parties that tried deliberately to mobilize as many voters as possible for their cause. Although it is true that Democrats tended to be more humble folk and Whigs more prosperous, both parties nevertheless commanded the loyalties of all kinds of Americans, from all social classes and in all sections. The social diversity of the two parties had important implications. It fostered horse trading compromises within each party that prevented either from assuming extreme or radical positions. By the same token, the geographical diversity of the two parties retarded the emergence of purely sectional political parties, temporarily suppressing, through compromise, the ultimately uncompromisable issue of slavery. When the two-party system began to creak in the 1850s, the Union was mortally imperiled. My goodness, excuse me. Wow. I like that picture. Look at that cute little picture. That is a dog. Okay. I think that's about it, because I'm skipping varying viewpoints, and I'm leaving in a few minutes. Okay.